This is the first time we've been in a room with this amount of people in person for quite a long time. So it's quite an honour to be back. Thank you for coming. Without further ado, Paul.
Thank you very much, Neil. Absolutely fantastic to see everyone. And from across the cohorts, as Neil said, it's really great to be given together this first social innovation lecture. So what we thought we'd do for this first one is, rather than give a specific paper or a bit of research, we would give a sort of overview of our thinking about social innovation linked into the SDGs. What we've done is we've split the lecture into 3 different parts. And in the spirit of equality, Neil and I will do 1.5 parts each. So equal time. So what we're going to start off is by talking a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for thinking about social innovation and some of the problems or blockages that we see in achieving them. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the role of climate in the Sustainable Development Goals, because certainly when Neil and I, and this reflects our own personal backgrounds, when we started off in the social innovation space, we were focused really very much on poverty and inequality, and sustainability in the environment was just another social problem to be addressed. But increasingly, it's become very obvious that climate or environment and social issues are intertwined. So we think it's really important to talk about that relationship and some of the tensions or apparent tensions that emerge. And then finally, Neil will talk about ideas around a way of thinking about social innovation as social organizing. So it's like a different set of ideas, taking our typology of social, intra, extra a little bit further from what we had before. So that's the plan of attack for the next 45 minutes or thereabouts. The world, I don't need to tell you, as social innovation students, the world is faced with a range of very deep-rooted social problems, as you know. We've still got not far off 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. We've got 1 billion people without access to electricity. We've got 1 billion people without access to safe drinking water. We've got 83 million people who are displaced, have been forcibly displaced. We have a climate emergency. We could go on for a very long time thinking about and talking about all the different social issues and problems that have emerged. And the Sustainable Development Goals have emerged as a framework or a plan for a way that we might think about and address these different social issues. And as you know, 193 countries signed up to these 17 goals back in 2005 with the aim of reaching them by 2030. And when they first emerged, a lot of people, including us, were pretty skeptical about whether it would have any impact or not. But actually, it's been really interesting to see how lots of different types of organization have sought to engage with the news, the SDGs in different ways. So you might have a set of activists, you might have a multinational corporation, you might have a big NGO, some government actors, all coming together with a very different sense of a particular problem and the issues that exist. But this is providing a kind of framework or a vocabulary, if you like, for talking about it. So it's what colleagues in sociology might call a boundary object. So it's interesting. So it's been interesting to see how that's developed. And there always has to be a but, doesn't there? There always has to be a but. Progress towards the SDGs has been painfully slow. There was a sort of slightly gloomy editorial came out in the journal Nature last year, which showed that of the 17 SDGs, just 2 were close to being achieved, and that was before the pandemic. Obviously, since COVID's come along, things have moved much further back. And in the editorial, they argued that this means that we need to kind of recalibrate, rethink the whole timescale around the SDGs and what we need to achieve now. I think it's a little bit too gloomy to be talking about that, but clearly there's a problem and there's a sense of urgency that we need to address. So part of the skepticism, I think, that a lot of people have about the SDGs or had about the SDGs concerns what happened in the past. Do people know what these are? Yes, somebody knows.
Millennium Development Goals.
That's right, they're the Millennium Development Goals. They're the predecessor to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they were launched in great fanfare back in 2000. And already here we are in 2021, a group of social innovation students in the classroom don't know what the Millennium Development Goals. Now, actually, there's a lot of debate about how effective or otherwise the the Millennium Development Goals were and the progress that we achieved towards them. But clearly, we didn't do as much as we hoped. We really didn't, for example, solve goal 1, which is about eradicating poverty, extreme poverty and hunger. But we clearly didn't achieve that. So that's where I think some of the nervousness comes in. There was another one, Neil, you're telling me about one that predates the Millennium Development Goals.
Yeah, in the 90s, there was Local Agenda 21, which was a bottom-up approach where all local authorities had to take action. I remember having to write reports, the usual stuff, diversity, financial, Local Agenda 21. Again, huge amount of activity which just disappeared into the void, basically.
So the question is, how do we make sure that the SDGs don't go the way of the MDGs and Local Agenda 2021? So that's the question. Where do we go from here if we're going to scale impact and make deep-rooted change with regard to the most deep-rooted social issues and problems? This is Neil's slide. I think it's very important to put this slide up because, of course, there aren't any easier straightforward answers for how we meet all 17 SDGs by 2030. I wish I could stand here and tell you this is in the next 30 minutes. This is exactly what we need to do in order to do that. That's obviously not possible. If anyone tells you it is possible, they're probably not being completely honest with you. Even Dr. Stott, with his huge brain right here, probably couldn't manage to answer that particular question.
Cheap jibes already.
So what we're going to do is not give you all the answers, but we're going to make some arguments. We're going to do that in 3 ways. We're going to start off by talking about what we see as some core blockages in the social innovation ecosystem, and we think that these blockages are impeding progress towards the SDGs, and they need to be unblocked. Second of all, we're going to talk about that issue I mentioned before about the apparent tension between climate and the other SDGs and how they're intertwined and interlinked, and how we really need to think carefully about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about social organizing, as I mentioned before, as a way of approaching the SDGs. So let's go straight into the blockages, some of the problems for why we're not making faster progress. So the first blockage we want to talk about concerns money. So to achieve the SDGs, it's going to be very, very expensive. The UN itself estimates that we're going to need between $5 and $7 trillion per year. Clearly, that can't all come from government. On the positive side, the impact investment market is growing really, really fast. It was 715 billion last year, and it's going to be much bigger this year. It's growing very, very, very quickly, and that's fantastic because we need that capital. We need that capital to be invested if we're going to make meaningful progress towards the goals. However, one of the problems is that that capital, those impact investors, are not engaging directly with the communities and stakeholders that they're investing in. There was a really interesting study from the UK that came out last year that found that while 93% of impact investors say that they align their objectives with the targets of the SDGs, with the goals of the SDGs, only 48% sought to achieve specific targets, and only 11% actually engaged directly with communities, customers, workers, and other stakeholders to assess their impact. Only 11% of those investors are actually having a presence on the ground. That is really, really low. That is really, really low. So if they're not actually engaging, if they're not having a presence on the ground, how are they assessing the type of change that they're making? Well, often they're using these really high-level indicators, arm's length indicators, often using data that's not of very high quality. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it really doesn't work very well at all. And sometimes it's actually making things worse. So let me just give you a very quick example from my own experience of how that's making things worse. About 10 years ago, as you know, I volunteered at Keystone, where Neil was chief executive. And Keystone did lots of different things, but one of the things they did was to support long-term unemployed people back into the labour market. And at that time, there was a series of government contracts that were put out to tender in order to finance that. And success in those contracts was measured by proportion of clients into employment for X months. But a whole bunch of private companies came in to take some of those contracts, but they would screen out people who disabilities, perhaps. They would screen out people who had mental health issues. They screen out people without formal qualifications, to screen out people who'd been employed for more than a year, and they would focus their efforts instead on the easy cases that they thought they could place. And on paper, these companies were doing an amazing job at placing all these long-term unemployed people. And the non-profits and the social enterprises were doing a pretty ordinary job, a terrible job. But if you actually looked on the ground, you could see that what the social enterprises and non-profits were doing were working with a very different type of client. So the impact was arguably much greater, but you can't see that if you're taking this arm's length approach that a lot of these impact investors are. So we need, like, the fact that impact investment is growing and we have this pool of capital that people want to apply at social problems, that is fantastic, but we also need these people to engage. That's really, really important. So that's the first blockage we want to talk about or highlight. The second one is about business, real business. So one of the big differences between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals is the way that business has been integrated into the process. So the UN realized, I mean, and we've talked about this in class, people who have been through the program a lot, that we need the capabilities, we need the resources of big business in order to address some of the most deep-rooted social problems. And the UN realized that, and so they involved a lot of people from the business world into the design of the goals and some of the metrics. Paul Polman, for example, he was a key person who was involved in designing some of the SDGs. However, while a lot of companies use the language of the SDGs and talk about the SDGs, it's often in a very superficial way. There was a really interesting study by two Dutch sustainability researchers last year, and they looked at the 2,000 largest stock-listed companies from around the world, and they measured their engagement with the SDGs. Found that, you know, again, if you look at the sustainability reports, the language of the SDGs is infused throughout what's going on, but they're not bringing them into core strategy, and they're not linking them to specific targets. And so the bottom line of the research was that corporate involvement in the SDGs is overall still limited. Companies treat the SDGs as a scheme with non-committal implications. It's a pretty damning indictment, really. It was interesting that they found 3 exceptions. That was three countries where the picture was a little bit different: in Japan, South Korea, and Thailand. And the explanation there was that the government had played a much more prominent role in promoting the SDGs and also enforcing them, legally enforcing them through legislation. So I think that, I mean, Neil will pick up on that a little bit later. It tells a story. And what these researchers hint at, and what other people have asked more directly, is whether we can, the current generation of multinational companies are really capable of making the sort of change that is needed to embed purpose in what they do, or whether actually we need to look at the next generation of businesses, the new sets of entrepreneurs who are creating firms now. And the UN has pivoted somewhat in this direction with its Entrepreneurs for Social Change program. And of course, you see it when you, all the entrepreneurs that you meet around the world, you see the entrepreneurs that are coming through in this program and elsewhere, that, you know, often people now think in a very different way about business than previous generations did. And when they're creating their businesses, purpose is baked into what they actually do. So they don't have to retrofit all this stuff after you've already been created, which is really difficult. It's actually in there from the start. So, and you only have to look at what's happening, for example, the sustainable entrepreneurship movement in Africa, for example, which is really exciting to see what the future might hold. I'm not saying that we should give up necessarily on the current generation of firms, but there are questions about their ability to change and adapt to this new environment. So the third blockage that we want to highlight sort of moves towards the social sector. It's the way that people think about scale in the social innovation space. So as you know, what often happens in the social impact space when we think about skills, people look for something that's worked really well in one place and they try to replicate it exactly in another place. And it doesn't work very well often because social problems manifest themselves very differently in different places. I remember one of the first projects that I was involved in nearly 20 years ago was about social enterprise support in the UK. And you might think that social enterprise support, for homelessness and supporting homeless people in the UK. And you might think that homelessness and the organizational solutions needed for homelessness would manifest itself in more or less equally in two English cities like, say, Bristol and Liverpool, for example. But the reality on the ground was actually quite different. The dynamics of homelessness across English cities was really very different. And so you needed different models in order to solve that. And so when you apply that same logic across countries and across cultures, the issues become much more complicated. So many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the Ashoka Globalizer Initiative, which has a really interesting and quite different way of thinking about how you scale social impact in the social innovation space, in the social sector. And they talk about how it's really important to think about scaling impact without necessarily scaling organizations themselves, because as they point out, oftentimes the impact that people are having in communities is based in local relationships, it's based in the social innovators' knowledge of local circumstances, and that can't easily be scaled. So their initiative is all about how do we get promising social innovators to scale their idea without necessarily growing their organization. I think it's really a powerful point, because when you grow, sometimes the impact is actually undermined. And in many ways, this was the philosophy that was imbued in Cambridge Social Ventures. When it started, it very clearly did not have a growth logic, it had an impact logic. And I still remember really clearly the first time I heard one of the business coaches say to one of the social entrepreneurs, "We don't think you should grow your venture. We don't think you should grow your venture." And she was quite shocked. I was quite shocked watching. She was quite shocked being told this, but it was also, I think, a huge relief to her. And the advice was, actually, you're having amazing impact here in the community, partly because you're working directly with the entrepreneurs, partly because you know this community and all the key stakeholders really well. If you go and start doing this in other cities, then you're going to be more and more removed from the front line. And so I think we need to think in a different way about impact. I think the impact about scaling, I think the impact investing community has been too influenced by ideas from business that we need to have these massive organizations. That's not the way to scale impact necessarily. So the final blockage we want to talk about links to that, and it's about the focus on the top-down nature of a lot of the interventions that you see in the social impact space, which is excluding the voice of marginalized communities. And now, this is obviously a tricky issue. There are some issues like climate we'll talk about later. Clearly, you need top-down stuff to happen. You need powerful actors to stand up and be accounted for. But too often we see that communities are having solutions imposed on them in a way that's not accountable, and it's not very effective. It's obviously a very complex issue. There's a great book that just came out actually by Jeremy Levine called Constructing Community, and he did an ethnography actually, and showed in a really interesting way how the people that claim to speak on behalf of communities don't necessarily represent community views. We actually did a podcast with them, didn't we, in our YouTube channel? It's really interesting. So the issue around how you engage communities is really complex. It's really resource intensive. And of course, sometimes communities need structure, but at the moment, we're not seeing enough of social innovations and social impact organizations supporting communities to frame and develop solutions to the problems that they face. One of the most interesting sort of ways of approaching this was actually that I've come across, was when I visited Melbourne, and I met a woman called Yoko Akama, who's a professor of design at RMIT, and she developed a really interesting methodology that was engaging with Indigenous communities across the Asia Pacific to support them in developing particular approaches to promoting their resilience and getting them to share that across other communities. It was really, really interesting. So I think potentially we need more interventions like that. So that is the summary of the sort of four sort of problems that we see in this kind of space. So for reasons that why perhaps the SDGs we're not moving forward with them as fast as we might. We're not seeing these are the only ones, or even necessarily the most important ones, but these are important ones that we think we need to address and talk about.
Okay, thank you. You're almost live.
I've got quite a few more slides.
I think,
but
sorry.
you can,
Oops.
you can talk now if you want.
No, seamless. Rehearsed.
I was going to say, I thought I was taking over there, but it's fine. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part we wanted to talk about was issues to do with climate, and this tension that I talked about before, and the fact that, you know, when we started, we were really thinking about climate as just another social problem. And now it's very clear, it's very obvious that climate and all the other issues around the SDGs are intertwined. And what's also happened is there's some interesting tensions between people who should be on the same side, social innovators interested in addressing poverty, social innovators interested in addressing climate, who are actually disagreeing about how best to approach the problem. And I think that tension is captured quite neatly in this quote here. And the idea being that for a lot of people in the social impact space, in order to achieve a lot of the SDGs, in order to move people out of poverty, in order to address inequality, we've got to have growth, clearly. We've got to grow the economy, especially in the poorest places in the world. At the same time, if we grow the economy at the same rate as we have been, then we're going to destroy the planet. So what do you do? How do you approach this? There's three different sets of ideas about how you address this particular issue, which I'll run through very briefly before I hand over to Neil. The first sort of way that people think about how we might address this tension is simply to prioritize economic growth. And clearly, Neil and I are not economists, but we work in a business school and a university where there are lots of economists. We're even friends with some of them. And they might sometimes say to us, Paul, Neil, you do realize that you're essentially wasting your time with all this social innovation stuff, because we know in economics, development economics, we know that the best way to address deep-rooted social issues like poverty and inequality is through economic growth. So what we need to do is to make the institutions that underpin markets function effectively, and we need to get businesses to function effectively in the poorest places in the world. Then they say, actually, you know what? You're not just wasting your time, you're actually making things worse, because you're saying to these people in some of the poorest places in the world that they should be starting social enterprises instead of regular businesses. And these social enterprises, they don't grow as quick, so you're trapping them in poverty. And they say, actually, if you focus on pure innovation, the idea around the environment sustainability will be solved, because we'll come up with all these amazing technological solutions. And so it's a kind of, there won't be a tension to be addressed. So from our standpoint, that isn't a very satisfactory way of thinking about things, in part because it's business as usual. It hasn't served us very well, and we don't have the time. We don't have the time in order to continue with that experiment. On the other side, you've got the degrowth movement, who take the opposite approach, and they prioritize in a very straightforward way the environment. I think degrowth is really interesting. It started in the 1970s, a group of French activists and intellectuals realizing that we couldn't keep producing and consuming in the way that we do now, that we needed to take a different approach, and we actually needed to shrink the economy. We need to engage in less production and consumption. And this idea, I suppose, was really considered much too radical to be taken seriously, but it is quite interesting how some of the ideas have seeped into the mainstream. There was a really interesting paper by Thomas Roulet in Harvard Business, our colleague Thomas Roulet, many of you have been taught by him, in Harvard Business Review, about degrowth business models and how actually businesses can tap into this different movement. There's also an economic anthropologist called Jason Hickel at the University of London, and he's really articulate in expressing how degrowth could fit into modern political economy. Absolutely, definitely worth reading. It's amazing stuff. However, the problem there's a couple of issues with the degrowth movement. One is, in the poorest places in the world, clearly we do need growth. We do need economic growth, so that is problematic. Second of all, politically, you're not going to get Joe Biden stand up and say, I'm going to make sure that the American economy is smaller next year than it is this year. So there is, while many of the ideas are really important and they're starting to seep into mainstream thinking, politically, there's a significant issue about whether these ideas are going to be applied. And then the third option, this is my last slide, Neil, so you're on next.
It's very kind of you.
The third option is around green growth, and this is really trying to exploit the sort of take advantage of the tension between the two, really, and it's trying to see the climate emergency potentially as an opportunity. And I suppose this is very much where the current debate around climate and social innovation is at the moment. This is the set of ideas that the UN are trying to promote. But at the same time, there's particular practices that we need in order to achieve this type of green growth and this green economy remain very unclear. There's some amazing examples, some amazing individual business models, some companies and social enterprises that are doing really amazing stuff. And I put this reference here because I think it's such a great paper by Martin Capasso, and what he and a bunch of his colleagues, and what they explain really clearly is to achieve the sort of green economy and the sort of green growth that the UN are advocating in order to achieve both the social and environmental SDGs, you're going to need fundamental systemic change across the economy. You're going to need to structure the global economy in a different way, and you're going to need governments to collaborate in order to achieve that. And we're seeing no sign of that happening. Meanwhile, we're hurtling faster and faster towards a climate emergency, and these progress towards the other SDGs are really, really slow.
Thank you. Okay, so we literally metaphorically turn up the heat a bit. Okay, so climate, I mean, Paul set the scene. You know, climate has always been an issue ever since I've been involved in this sort of work, but, you know, it's becoming increasingly important. It is an existential crisis for our children, our children's children, who will experience a world that is radically different than ours if we're not very careful. In fact, you know, some things are too late. Some change will happen anyway because of the historic accumulation of carbon from the Industrial Revolution onwards, which is accumulated, will have an impact no matter what. And this is a struggle. This is a struggle for power and legitimacy, this whole debate. It's a struggle to protect or disrupt vested interests. And as I think we know, you know, vested interests do not let go of power, financial or otherwise, terribly easily. I'm thinking of big oil, for starters. And this is a struggle to secure social, economic, and climate justice. We are social innovators, that's why we have social in there, between generations, species, nations, and groups. So this idea of climate justice will become increasingly important. And the recent IPCC report is pretty brutal. I don't know if anyone's read it or read the summary. It is brutal and it pulls no punches. And, you know, it says here, it's code red for humanity. So where are we now? I mean, as Paul has you know, talked, we you know, at the moment, it's still a market-led is a dominant frame, okay? It wasn't always thus. We seem to have moved from a sort of public to a more market frame since the 80s, 90s, etc. And one could argue that neoliberalist economics debates have had something to do with that. We've had some international-led success, SDGs. I mean, can you imagine the arguments to get agreement on those SDGs? The person hours spent in rooms to achieve those is quite no mean achievement. But the governance is not clear, it's very laboured, and there has been mixed success, okay? Just for the nature of the beast, just because not everyone wants to play nicely, again, around vested interests. Interesting enough, there have been occasions, recently-ish, when internationally we have responded very well. When people decided to ban CFCs, carbons, refrigerators, etc., that happened relatively quickly and very thoroughly. Very thoroughly. And the reports recently that it has done some impact to the problem, which was the ozone layer. And if you look at the Atomic Scientist Bulletin, which moves a clock closer to midnight or away from midnight. In the past, due to nuclear issues, but now climate as well, when the clock actually goes back, it is usually because of international treaties, international agreements, which takes pressure off. So international is important, but frankly, I'm not entirely convinced it's fit for purpose at the moment. The other approach, which I think you'll see come more into play, is the state-led approach, okay? The pandemic has quite clearly reminded us of what the state can do if it puts its mind to it. You know, who'd have thought, in the UK at least, ex-zillions of people would have been put on furlough for over a year? Who'd have thought the things that, you know, the government and governments around the world have done were even possible until this moment? And we, business schools, other people, underestimated the importance and the power of the state. Now, of course, states vary. Some are less pleasant than others, and all have a tendency to be incredibly unpleasant if they put their mind to it. And this is a real danger that we face as we move forward, is if we cannot individually and collectively make more change, you know, if we can't improve things fairly rapidly, you know, either we'll end up in some crisis, chaos, and frankly, in the UK, we couldn't cope without toilet rolls for a couple of weeks. I mean, you know, remember that? You can imagine if it really got bad. And or we end up with more and more authoritarian governments, you know, pulling the strings, okay? And people, you know, moving to that, saying, we need this, we need this. So that's a danger, but the state has a very important role. There's a very good book came out recently by Michael E. Mann, not the sociologist Michael Mann. This guy's a climate person, and he's very blunt about this. You know, he talks about the noise, you know, even amongst those people who say they support change. And he has his list of Ds, which I thought was really clever. You know, the deniers, the deceivers, etc., etc. And in the middle, the downplayers, deflectors. You've got a lot of that going on at the moment. This is a struggle that we have to face up to. So just a couple of examples of struggle. So this is fairly recently. So this is hydrogen cars, hydrogen economy, which this idea has been around for a long time, over a century. But you've seen a battle line growing between those who think hydrogen should be green, you know, it's a natural process, or you make your hydrogen from fossil fuels. I wonder who is behind the argument for fossil fuels being used for that sort of hydrogen, okay? So you can see these battles emerging. On what on the surface looks like a positive thing, but there's lots of stuff going on underneath the surface. This is not new. This is the dark satanic mills of the Northern England. Industrial Revolution. So why was it so dank and dark and dirty? I mean, I was brought up in one of these places, which was all very dirty. You see the soot ingrained into the walls. Well, it's burning coal, isn't it? To make steam, to power the mills, etc. But interestingly, it didn't have to be like that. There was a moment in time where we were going in a different direction. Okay, we were going water. And we're not talking little water wheels, small mills. We're talking about vast systems of reservoirs and canals and rivers to feed numerous mills to deliver clean power, okay? And it was winning, But it went off, coal and steam steam was really dangerous at the time. I think the damn things used to blow up on a regular basis. One of the reasons why is because these proponents of massive water schemes, which involve lots of people working together to build, pay for, and to build a reservoir, water coming down, working out who gets water when, to power it. It was a lot of organization, a lot of sharing, and a lot of the people involved did not want to share or play nicely. They preferred the power they got from what they thought at the time operating their own mills, using coal, etc., etc. There are other reasons, which include breaking the unions at the time, or breaking combination. But from my reading, it's a very interesting book, which I'll show you in a second, Fossil Capital, which takes you through this argument. There was a moment where water could have been more important than coal, okay, which was lost. Mainly because the employers, in particular, the capitalists of the time, the mill owners, would not cooperate with the local, regional, state, apart from some very small schemes. Okay, very fascinating. The second, this I came across, this is a coin-operated electric car charger, New York, 1900. Okay? So who knew? I mean, electric cars were around before gasoline cars, electric vehicles. Lots of the UK and the US used vast amounts of electric vehicles before gasoline. For those of you old enough to remember, most of the British milk floats were electric. During the First and Second World War, UK and US and other countries turned more and more to electric. There was infrastructure, okay, there's problem about batteries, etc., but there was an infrastructure. But then oil, fossil fuels, fossil fuel-driven vehicles took over. And again, there wasn't really a good reason. One was quite democratic in some ways, involved public investment, almost slightly less so, apart from building roads, I suppose. But, you know, again, these moments when we had the opportunity to go a different way, and in the 1900s, people were quite clear that climate change was a problem. You know, the industrials and other people were quite clear that you could see it, you can see it, can't you? You can smell the smoke, the dust, the dirt from coal, etc. Why I put these up? Well, A, because as you know, those of you who know me, I'm very fascinated in the long view of things. Lost opportunities, yes, but it just shows you the problems we face individually and collectively when we try and make change, especially if it involves a lot of players with vested interests. It is not an easy process. So many of you will remember, and some of you will become very familiar with, our typology, which we use on the masters and other places, of social entrepreneurship, people creating ventures to make social, economic, environmental change, social intrapreneurship, people making social change within organizations, big and small, particularly corporates, and one, frankly, we made up at the time, social extrapreneurship, the people who make the linkages across, you know, various different ecosystems. This is the typology that we worked to for the last 5 years and taught to. But increasingly, we still think it's very useful, but we don't think it is enough. We've been worrying at this for a little while. So this is a work in progress. This is not finished. This is throwing out ideas at this stage. So the big question, and this borrows from a very famous American sociologist from the 40s and 50s, Laswell, who decides who gets what, when, and how? This is the big question that faces us all during climate change and what will come next, okay? When the waters lap around New York, or it's too hot to live on the California coast, or Bangladesh is, 80% underwater, who decides who gets what, when, and how? This is the crucial question that we're all going to have to face up to in the coming years, and fairly quickly. So basically, the SDGs are fundamentally a challenge of organizing from local to global, okay? So we're often very good at the micro level. We're often very good at organizing at a small level, social enterprises, et cetera, We might be reasonably good at the macro level, UNICEF, big NGO, et cetera. Maybe a little in the middle of the nation state, but less so than perhaps we were. But this is a continuum of organizing that we need to pay attention to. It's not just one or the other, okay? It's all at different times and different places. And frankly, you have to do all three things if you want to make significant change. And as we were thinking about this, we thought, well, where are the social innovators now? okay? And I borrowed some of these ideas from some 1960s work on public interest theory, not public choice, it's a different thing, public interest theory. So the idealists, what ought to be, that's their view of the world. Making moral judgments by knowledgeable, compassionate elites. We know best. And frankly, all of us in this room suffer to a certain extent from this. Yes, myself included, okay? Rationalists, what is possible, tend to turn to deliberative and instrumental processes, get the best we can. So we're talking governments, we're talking big foundations, we're talking about impact investors, etc. Okay? And then the realists, what should be, but isn't. So it views society as comprising multiple conflicting interests and groups which endlessly contend with each other, such as social movements, Extinction Rebellion, etc. Okay? So there are three different ideal types, if you like. Now, life is not this simple. I think you have to be all the three things. But what has been happening, perhaps, in my view, is we have a lot of idealists, we've got a lot of realists, if you like, but less rationalists, less people who are working, with some notable exceptions in this room, in local authorities, in the state, to think about data-driven services and practices, okay, to make real change. So I think we need all those three approaches at the same time. Okay. So thinking about it, again, adapting this from elsewhere, you can think of social innovation as a reflexive practice, okay? So, you need to recognize what's going on, what needs to change. You need to reflect, you need to learn from the past, rethink practices, envision future possibilities, and then respond. And this cycle goes round and round and round. So I think we'll incorporate this in our teaching a little bit more, this idea of reflexive practice. Okay, it's never stationary. It moves as circumstances change. This is a magpie, for those of you who don't know, a UK bird. I'm sure many countries have magpies in different shapes and form. We are somewhat of intellectual magpies. We don't just stick, obviously, to the business literature. We draw on different things, including political theory, anthropology, etc., to come up and shape ideas. And this set of ideas draws quite heavily from work in the 70s by a chap called Rothman, who is still alive, he's 94 now. He had a second career as a comedian. He came up with a typology which is based at a community level, and we've adapted this and updated it for a much broader thing. So it's micro, macro, etc. And he and we now, adapting it, come up with three key areas of practice. So one is social planning. So it's technical processes of problem solving, rational deliberation, and controlled change, government programs, etc., etc. Now, many of us who've been involved in community activities for many years, like myself, might feel a little bit uncomfortable about this, because we've been fighting against the role of the state and, top down, etc., etc. But, and I'm just throwing this question out for now, how on earth can we make the changes that are needed to cope with climate change that hits the UK, as well as the rest of the world, without some of this going on? Seriously, okay? Seriously. Second approach is social development, which you could read as community development as well. It's participatory, it's inclusive, it focuses on consensus building, things like the Peace Corps, Community Development Corporations in America, and Development Trust in the UK. Okay, my bread and butter for 30 years, trying to build consensus around issues to create change in localities. Okay, and then the third approach is social advocacy, which focuses on organizing marginalized groups and achieving social justice, such as Black Lives Matter. Okay, so there are three key again, ideal types, ideal approaches. And people may fit into one or another. Our argument, tentatively, subject to an essay that we're going to write over the next couple of months, our argument is you need all three to be a successful social innovator moving forward. You need to learn the tools, techniques, and practices of social planning, of social development, and social advocacy, and know when to use them at the right time, in the right place, for most effect. That's the premise, okay? Now, the story gets a little bit complicated from here on in. I'm not going to go through these slides in a lot of detail, but just to show you where we're moving to, again, based on the work of Rothman and others. Comes out of a social work tradition, by the way. So you've got the three elements. You've got a Venn diagram. I think one of the first things I was told when I joined the business school in 2015, you cannot have a Venn diagram without filling in the blanks in the middle. It's not a Venn diagram. Okay, so here you need to do all three things at the same time. Where it gets interesting is at the overlaps. Okay, so what we've done is start building, again, it's a work in progress, a typology going into a bit of depth about when you take one approach, let's say in this case, social planning, and as a dominant, and then you have an element of the other approach in the mix, okay? So social planning is rationalistic, data-driven, tends to be top-down, Green New Deal, etc. Sometimes a sledgehammer to crack a nut, sometimes leaves people to one side, isn't nuanced perhaps, but you're bringing some participatory planning, bringing some involvement, you're getting closer. Transition towns in the UK are an example of that. And then if you want to go a little bit further, a bit like social intrapreneurs, you're having more policy advocacy work going on, okay? So you can see the nuances there. Same with social development, you know, different ways of bringing in different tools to do things. Same with social advocacy, you know. Now, social advocacy is very interesting because this is where, you know, it gets more challenging, if you like, because you're pushing the boundaries. You're pushing the boundaries. So movements like the civil rights movement, movements like Black Lives Matter, etc., have pushed the boundaries, you know, and when people get frustrated, they push them even further. And when we look back on them, you know, we think, yeah, that's good, it's good. At the time, the resistance to those movements was phenomenal, okay? And people, you know, apart from those brave people who step up and join Extinction Rebellion at the moment, find it hard to take this sort of really activist role. And I would posit also, most people, hopefully not the people in this room, but a lot of people out there are no longer trained in any shape or form in any of these skills, let alone activism, okay? So you know this is a pet theory of mine. We have been stripped as citizens of the skills to be good citizens. We've been stripped of the opportunities to engage in political power, the small p and the big P, partly because maybe think it's boring, partly because the power of trade unions, you know, youth clubs, whatever, all those places where people learned to organize have disappeared, frankly. So, again, this is, you know, work in progress. These are ideas we're playing with. And obviously we will take criticism and comments now, sooner and later on this, but we do intend to try and work this up a bit more and help try and provide some tools. I mean, the origin of this partly comes out of our work, Michelle and I's work, as we travel through the UK around looking at community organisations, what they're actually doing rather than what people thought they were doing. And partly the result of many debates in class and elsewhere on these issues. So this is where we're going, but not a finished by any shape. So this has been fairly negative, okay? But unfortunately, we are faced with some, you know, really confounding and challenging issues. And if we can't face up to them as students or ex-students in the social innovation space, who can? You know, if we can't ask difficult questions of ourselves and check our own motivations and values, who can? Okay? And that's us as well. So these are modest, but these are a few commitments that we want to make as a centre. So one is to deliver a climate carbon impact statement for all social ventures. So at the moment, every social venture that goes through our programme, Nicole, our new director is at the back, many of you know Nicole, have to have a social impact statement. Yes? As part of their agreement with us. We're now going to develop a climate impact statement as well with those ventures. Number one. Number two, we are going to try and prioritise those ventures tackling in some shape or form climate issues, be it social, species, or whatever. Okay, we really do need to push the button there. We want to offer new low carbon postgraduate courses, online only, work in progress, watch this space, hopefully some news by Christmas this year, and find some way, with the help of our colleagues, Carmen being one of them, is how to offset master's students and faculty travel in some shape or form. So these are some fairly modest, but these are some things that we thought that we would try and do moving forward. Of course, the most important thing that we can do, Paul, I, and our colleagues, Michelle, Nicole, Joanna, Anna, etc., is to get you excited, even though it's bloody gloomy, get you engaged, get you thinking about your own and others' practices to try and make change. If we don't, who will?